if you look at the climate debate, for me, there's I think a symmetrical problem that the entire debate faces. So on the one hand, you have the sort of climate activist side. On the other hand, you have the so-called climate denier side. I actually think both sides have opposite but symmetrical naiveties or problems. The climate denier side, I think, actually have too little faith in the natural science, because the natural science of climate change, which is basically statistical modeling, is pretty good for what it is. And so I think they should have more faith in the science. I think they have too little faith in the science. The problem with the climate activist side, though, is I think they have the opposite but symmetrical problem of too much faith in the social science. And the reason that matters is that, of course, the reason we care about climate change is we presume two things: that it will have a social impact that is also negative. And that presumes not just that we understand the climate, it's also to presume that we understand the nature of society. What is society? How ought society to be? What are the internal mechanisms of change within society? How is society impacted by extra societal factors such as climate?
Have you ever wondered why, despite overwhelming scientific evidence, global climate action seems stuck in a perpetual state of inertia? What if our approach to understanding climate change is flawed? In this episode, we dive into a conversation with Dr. Calum Nicholson, a scholar who challenges the very foundations of how we perceive and communicate climate issues. Through an interdisciplinary lens that bridges social anthropology, migration studies, and human geography, Dr. Nicholson offers a perspective that goes beyond traditional scientific narratives. Drawing from his extensive research as the Director of Research at Danube Institute and a visiting fellow at the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, Dr. Nicholson unpacks the complex cultural and philosophical dimensions that often get overlooked in climate debates. His insights promise to challenge listeners' preconceived notions and invite a more nuanced understanding of environmental challenges. Currently teaching at the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education and author of recently published edited volume, Climate Migration, Critical Perspectives for Law, Policy and Research, Dr. Nicholson brings a unique intellectual rigor to a conversation that promises to transform how we think about climate action. Thank you so much, Dr. Calum, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Dr. Calum, can we first begin this conversation by first understanding, according to you, that why climate action is not a priority for us right now?
Well, it's not so much that it's not a priority. It's more that I think that, let me frame my thinking on it, is that I think climate change is real, and I think the science is pretty good. The concern I have around it is the significance we give the science in terms of how we actually react, so in terms of policy making and so on. If you look at the climate debate, for me, there's I think a symmetrical problem that the entire debate faces. So on the one hand, you have the sort of climate activist side. On the other hand, you have the so-called climate denier side. I actually think both sides have opposite but symmetrical naiveties or problems. The climate denier side, I think, actually have too little faith in the natural science, because the natural science of climate change, which is basically statistical modeling, is pretty good for what it is. And so I think they should have more faith in the science. I think they have too little faith in the science. The problem with the climate activist side, though, is I think they have the opposite but symmetrical problem of too much faith in the social science. And the reason that matters is that, of course, the reason we care about climate change is we presume two things: that it will have a social impact that is also negative. And that presumes not just that we understand the climate, it's also to presume that we understand the nature of society. What is society? How ought society to be? What are the internal mechanisms of change within society? How is society impacted by extra societal factors such as climate. So the problem with the climate debate for me is that, yes, the deniers, so to speak, have too little faith in the natural science, but the climate activist side have too much faith in the social science. And my general sense with climate change is that our understanding of it is, yes, I think informed by a rich understanding of the natural science, but I also think it is at least as informed by an impoverished understanding of ourselves. And so that's the problem with the climate debate. So it's not that we don't need climate action as such, or rather, it's not that climate change isn't changing, and it's not that there are not societal problems, but how you actually identify the causal linkage between the two is much more problematic. And there is an interesting question in all this about to what extent should there be climate policies as such? To what extent are the problems we're facing in society in the context of climate change actually any different than the problems we were facing anyway and otherwise? Problems to do with poverty, or sustainability, or economic growth, or whatever your variable is, pollution. What is gained? Well, there's an old classic essay question that most students have encountered: what is gained and what is lost when, in this case, when we privilege climate in our analyses of human problems? And I would argue we don't gain as much as we hope, and we perhaps gain more than we lose more than I think we realize.
Doctor, would you argue that the fact the way existentialism is also attached with the climate change problem makes it put on a separate scale than developmental goals or other ideas? Because the sense how this climate change debate and how it is manifested in today's world, it's also related with our existence, considering how, as you said, natural science is clear that our natural cycles are breaking down. I'm not commenting as to how would they interact with us, but the fact that it also raises a question to our existence, does it put this particular problem on a different scale?
Now that's a very interesting question, because you've identified something I think that's very true, which is that the way we talk about climate is in existential terms. We often talk about it as a threat to the species in some sense. It's worth breaking down what we mean by that. Now, climate change is clearly not a threat to, let's break it down on a couple of axes: temporal and I suppose life as well. So climate change is not a threat to life as such, right? Life will still exist, perhaps in a different form. In a few million years, humans probably won't exist regardless of what we do. Life is not
Calum,
yeah.
Can I add you to add another layer of nuance? When we talk about biodiversity loss and endangered species, we see that millions of species are already extinct, and a lot of them are getting extinct in the ocean. Would you want to deal with that also? Because humans' adaptive capacity could be something that we could talk about, but also if you could factor in biodiversity loss and other aspects in your answer.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think when we look at climate change in general, I think the reason, as I said before, that we care about it is we presume it has an impact on us that will be negative. That's the general background assumption. Now, built into that is a concern for biodiversity to the extent to which it actually affects us and the sustainability of ecosystems on which we depend. So I think the biodiversity element has to be understood through a human lens. Because we need to remember that climate change is not simply a moral concern of individuals. The reason we're talking about it today, the reason there's COP29 going on, is because it's an issue that's risen to the level of the nation states, and the nation states are interested in it because nation states are, for better and worse, the organizational model in the post-colonial world that is dominant, and so therefore those are our best units by which we solve our collective problems. And so when we talk about climate, we are talking about it in terms of its impact on people these days, because the institutes that are talking about it at the highest level are interested fundamentally in the well-being of their populations. And so with that in mind, I think when we think about climate change as an existential issue, it's worth breaking down what we actually mean by an existential issue. Because I don't think it's a threat to life as such. I mean, I don't mean individual species, but life, in a sense, will go on, even in a sense we don't understand. So it's not a threat at that scale. It's also, I don't think, a threat to the individual, or indeed, it's not a threat to our species as such, because we're a highly adaptable species. As a species, will survive. It may not in the long term, but I don't think climate change will make any difference. But then if you scale down to the individual, you and me, I don't think climate is very relevant to looking at our individual lives, because the context of our lives are always social, political, economic, and so on. It's worth noting that whenever people talk about climate hotspots, they tend to be talking about countries that are quite poor. It could be Bangladesh, or it could be sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what's interesting when we select those case studies is that we've actually already excluded from the analysis all the other variables that might be relevant, which is the contextual political economic conditions. So if we say a climate hotspot country is in sub-Saharan Africa, we have, by dint of choosing sub-Saharan Africa, we've excluded Germany from the equation. Why? Well, because Germany is a developed economy. So in making that selection, we are pre-selecting climate hotspots, and by pre-selecting them, we're excluding from the analysis the conditions that make them vulnerable to, for instance, climate change, which are the political economic conditions. So my point is to say, when we're looking at climate, we don't mean life or indeed the species or an individual. We're talking about a particular formulation of society. So what is that? Well, let's break that down. Well, clearly it's not referring to the formulation of society in the past, because those are gone anyway, and it can't be 100 years in the future, because we don't know what that will be. I mean, if you look at the way societies have changed in the last 100 years, the global population has gone from 2 or 3 billion up to 8 billion. We also, most of America now lives in the suburbs. If you go back 70 or 80 years, people were in the cities. They weren't in the suburbs. They didn't exist. The automobile did not exist. And so our societies have changed dramatically in the last 80 years, not because of climate. And indeed, it hasn't been a disaster. It's just been change. So we can't actually, when we think of the impact of climate change existentially, we're clearly not thinking of the past, because that's gone. And it can't be the super far in the future. A couple of generations in the future, because we can't imagine how different our world will be anyway, both in terms of population size and technology and social organization. So clearly, when we talk of the existential threat of climate change, we are talking about it to our culture right now, the status quo. So it's not the species level or the individual, it's a particular form of community. And if you think about what that is, it's a particular arrangement that we're used to right now, which will probably change anyway, because it wasn't there 100 years ago. And so when you actually start breaking it down, it's quite a narrow sense of human life that we're talking, a narrow understanding of ourselves. That is the thing that's under existential threat from climate change, allegedly. And even when you look at that, if you look at what that system is, loosely defined, it's a capitalist system. But people are always saying that capitalism should end because it's causing climate change. Well, it looks like it would end because of climate change. So it's so is that not a solution to the problem? So I find it often when you start analyzing what is the thing that we're presuming climate change is an existential threat to, when you actually start breaking it down, it's very hard to find out precisely what it is, other than simply what we're used to right now, which, by the way, will not be there regardless of climate change in 50 years, because society evolves and changes. So, but implied in your question is this idea of climate change is different because we frame it as an existential threat, whereas international development or developmental issues or poverty is not seen as an existential threat in quite the same way. I think in this I think we need to understand climate as, culturally speaking, in terms of its cultural significance, the significance we give it as an existential issue. For me, it's a millenarian movement. We can talk more about what I mean by that, but it's a classic, quite frankly, Christian millenarian movement. And I'm not speaking to the science of it. I have no problem with climate science, but the cultural significance we give the science is, I think, cultural. And if you look at the climate discussion, it's not coming out of even Catholic countries. It's not coming out of Islamic culture. It's not coming out of Confucian culture. It's not coming out of Hindu culture. It's coming out of Protestant nations. It's coming out of North America, Sweden. Greta Thunberg is a Swede. I don't know if she's a Protestant, but I don't think it's any coincidence that she is a Swede. It's worth noting that these movements tend to emerge occasionally in Protestant adjacent cultures. this idea that the world is living in sin, we must confront it and establish the utopia. And this is very much what the climate debate seems to be to me.
Dr. Calum, so as to put context to what you've just said and to bring in some ways in which climate change is being communicated today, if you permit, I would like to play a video and then take your cues as to what do you think about it, that what are the fallacies in the way it is being communicated and where do we fall short on understanding about the problem and the diagnosis of it. If you'd allow me, I please play that.
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Greenland is now losing 30 million tons of ice every hour. During the hour that we're in this room, 30 million tons will go from Greenland. That is fresh water coming off Greenland into the North Atlantic, where a key part of the ocean current circulation system is involved. It could be disrupted. Some scientists disagree, but more and more they're raising the alarm. And if you look at the bottom statement, these scientists say in this peer-reviewed study, we estimate it collapsed around mid-century. What? Some of the load-bearing elements of our entire Earth ecological system are at risk. And what are we doing? Just talking away, not making much progress. Again, I'm getting stirred up here, so I'll try to calm down.
So, I mean, it is one reference point which obviously the Nobel laureate and Vice President of the US is taking, but this could be a good way to contextualize how climate change activists these days try and communicate about climate change and muster climate action. How would you respond to this video and this way of communication?
Well, often what we hear is the use of statistics thrown out, but the problem is a stat is not a story, and stats are things that can be they have to be contextualized, and a fact alone only really means something in service of a narrative. I mean, you can say, so the fact of 30 million tons. Now, a lot of people let's just take that idea. So one of the problems with the climate debate is often people who are unhappy with the consensus around climate change will challenge the facts. They'll say, right, okay, I don't like those facts. I'll look at the data and I think actually those facts are inaccurate, or I have some other facts. And I think they're all kind of missing the point, because it doesn't matter what your facts are. Depending on how I contextualize the fact can have a very different meaning. So if I say to you, don't worry, only 30 million tons of ice melts in Greenland, you'll think, oh, good. But if I say, this is terrible, 30 million tons have melted in Greenland, the fact of 30 million tons doesn't change, but how I've presented it changes the meaning it gives you. Facts are, they say facts don't care about our feelings, but facts actually don't elicit from us feelings. The feelings are elicited by the narrative framing of the fact. And so I don't really think a decontextualized factoid, a citation of a tonnage, is really revealing very much, quite honestly. Now, and as I said, the big problem with the climate debate is people keep debating the facts, saying, well, that's not a real fact, or I think this fact is wrong, or something. It's not about that. The debate isn't about whether the facts are right or wrong. With all the climate issues, it's not about whether the science is right or wrong. You know what? I know a lot of scientists. They're pretty rigorous people. All the people I know are honest, hardworking people. But here's the great sort of fallacy in the culture. People think that people whose job it is to generate reliable facts are also people who can interpret what that means for us. But the action of crunching data, of gathering it through very methodical processes, in whatever context we're talking about, it could be melting ice. I don't know how they measured that, but I'm sure they have a very elaborate, I'm sure people spend their careers developing techniques to measure that. And they'll be really good, best in class techniques. And then all the data crunching and so on is a skill set. You need PhDs and years of study and postdoctoral research to get to the point where you can run your own projects doing that. I have a lot of friends who do that. But the thing is, those people are not necessarily the people who can then, just because they know the facts doesn't mean they have any insight on the political context in which we use these facts or which is meaningful. there's a good analog to this, which is the COVID debate. In my view, the science of COVID was really good. The virology of the disease, the epidemiology of how it spread in populations, the vaccine manufacturing, science was incredible. It's some of the greatest evidence of not only how effective our science can be, but how actually sophisticated our infrastructures are to gather data and share data in real time. It was really, really impressive what it revealed. However, the question of what we were supposed to do about COVID is not a question that science can answer, because it's actually a question not about the disease, it's a question about ourselves. What is a level of risk that is tolerable? There's a great quote from Jonathan Sumption where he said, "Is there more to life than the avoidance of death?" Now that's a very interesting question, because in COVID we were locking people in their houses saying all that matters is life above everything else. Quantity of life matters more than quality of life. Now, someone may hold that position, and that is entirely their right to do so. But my point is that there is no actual objective scientific answer to that question. What is there more to life than the avoidance of death? It's an inherently subjective question to do with culture and values and how we assess risk. The point I'm making is that when we start looking at what we do about something, take COVID as an example, the question of what we do is inherently subjective, is inherently political in that sense. It's something that requires people to make a value judgment on what is the best balance, what value on life as opposed to livelihood and all these sorts of things. And the same applies to climate. So when I see people like Al Gore citing all these facts, I don't think they're trying to be propagandists. I just don't think they're thinking about the issue with enough three-dimensionality. They're just seeing the science as the only discussion in town. But the truth is, there is not just the science. There's always the society that will receive or be impacted by or act upon or put to use the science. And we always have to think about that much more subjectively. And I think the big failure here, quite honestly, is that we have a culture that has been such a beneficiary of the amazing achievements of the natural sciences over the last few hundred years that we think that natural science and its methodology are not just a tool to use in a particular context, but it's the best way of understanding the human condition. And I am not sure that's fair or accurate, because most human problems are not ones that can be answered by gathering data. Most things that are meaningful to us are not things you can put in a spreadsheet. And so we have this culture where we think that the social sciences or philosophy are just amateur sciences. They just haven't grown up yet. One day they'll be as rigorous as the sciences. But it's an apples and oranges. And if you'll allow me, I'll give a very clear explanation, I think, as to why. The reason the sciences and the social sciences, the reason the social sciences will never become like the sciences is they study something fundamentally different. And what the difference is this, in my view. The sciences, the physical sciences, study something that is a unity. The laws of physics and chemistry apply everywhere equally in the same way. The laws apply their laws. The problem is the study of society, of us, of you and me, of even just me on my own when I'm thinking, is not a unity. It's a plurality. I disagree with myself throughout the day, depending on how many cups of tea I've had. We will definitely disagree over things. We may agree on some things and disagree with others. And that is not a fault, it's a feature of being human, the plurality of things. To kind of give you a very quick analog for that, if we had a room full of people and I dropped, if I had a room full of chairs and I dropped a grenade in the middle, but if I had perfect data on the room, on all the chairs and the weights and the materials and the grenade and so on and the trajectory, I could, in theory, if I had perfect data, model in a computer how the whole room would react. I could simulate the explosion where the chairs go. Here's the thing. If in that room there were people, what I could not model is how people would react. Some people might freeze. Some people might run away. Some foolish person might jump on the grenade to save everyone else. There are many different reactions to dropping that grenade in the room. The truth is, not only can we not know how people react, about how other people react, I don't know how I'll react. I genuinely don't know how I'd react to that situation. Would I be the person who jumped on the grenade or ran away or froze? We only know when we know. And indeed, I may not even react consistently, depending on many other factors. So the point is that the study of people, or the nature of us, is a plurality. The nature of things is a unity. And this is why the social sciences will never become the sciences, because they simply study different things. And the problem with the perspective of people like Al Gore is that he thinks the only thing that's worth listening to are the science. But a last comment I'll make, I used to work for an institute called the Climate Policy Institute, where I'm still an associate researcher. And I was always saying to my colleagues, I kept saying, we are not the Climate Policy Institute, we're the Climate Policy Institute. So we're not really in the business of generating science of climate. We're all about looking at what are the implications of the science for society, the policy. And that's the job. And that is not actually a hard science job. It's a social science and philosophical and cultural job to work out, okay, in context of all the other things in our lives, what is the significance of this scientific fact we've just been told? Is it good or bad? What is the ratio by which we should weigh its significance relative to other factors? So my response to Al Gore's point there is that there is a sort of tyranny or a sort of technocratic obsession with factoids like that. But facts are not arguments. You can use them to support arguments, but they're not substitutes for an argument. And I say, if you say the fact, you could argue that, you could use that fact to argue different things depending on what your emphasis is on. Someone could say only 30 million tons. Someone else could say, my God, 30 million tons.
So if I were to summarize, Dr. Calum, what you're saying is there are multiple truths and there's no objective conclusion to climate change. There are multiple truths to that.
Well, you know what, I have a slight issue with the word truth because it's, well, in a way that's constructive. These days we have a couple of problems. On the one hand, we have people saying, I have my own truth. Now, I think that's just opinion. You know, I think that's, if everyone has their own truth, then what's the point in the concept? And then some people say there is just the objective truth. But I'm also not really sure what that is either, because, so the word truth my issue with it is something I'm never quite sure what it's supposed to refer to. I think we use it in a very casual sense. Like you can say something and say, oh, that's perfectly true, you know. But I think that as an analytical concept, I find it to be a sort of false friend. But I do think we live, you know, what was certainly been the case is there used to be sort of authoritative narratives, but we've replaced authoritative narratives with, we no longer have authorities, we now just live in a world of authors. Everyone's authoring their own perspective, which I think is very constructive. So my point of saying, I wouldn't say there's multiple truths as such, but I would just say that it's simply the case that you can look at something and see it from several perspectives. So for instance, you can have, depending, the point is politics always exists. So you can have anything happen. You can have, we all know in the spectrum of newspapers there's left-wing and right-wing papers. So if you have, I don't know, Donald Trump's election, if you want to read if you can have it, the fact that he's elected, I think everyone apparently agrees with, right? So that's good. Now, but then you'll have the New York Post report in it saying, wonderful, Donald Trump elected. But then the New York Times will write it saying, terrible, Donald Trump elected. Now, the fact that he was elected doesn't change, but the perspective changes. Now, is that multiple truths or is it just meaning? Is it just the meaning we give it, the significance we give it, the implications we believe it has for us? That's not really about truth so much. It's about a sense of how we believe the world ought to be. And I think that's where we have legitimate plurality. And it's irreducible plurality. It's not even a case of whether it's good or bad that we disagree on this. It simply is the case. We always will. And that's the nature of human life, that we will never reconcile all our perspectives, and nor should we seek to.
This makes me question the way we are approaching this climate change problem as well. So right now, the debate is hinged on the fact that the entire world community is trying to move at least towards the direction of limiting global warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius of industrial level. So as per your explanation, the problem that we are trying to diagnose is not even the right question that we are asking ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's actually a nice way of putting it. I think that we keep looking at climate as a climate issue, but actually what we basically have is a cultural issue. And the truth is, most problems tend to be about ourselves. And I don't think I think also when we look at the climate debate, there is kind of a meta problem going on, or more reflexive problem going on in the climate debate. I look at the climate debate, and I find it really an interesting debate in terms of what the structure of the debate reveals about ourselves and the fault lines in our own culture. Because I think the way we've approached it in the Al Gore sense of saying, right, we just have this fact and this is the problem. It's a mindset that's kind of acting as if humanity doesn't really exist, that there are just things, and that we are all automata, and we're all like billiard balls being hit by things. This is not who we are. Like there's an understanding of the human condition that I think is deeply inhuman in a sense, underlying all this. It's based on an exclusion, not just ignorance of what the human condition, but an exclusion of any understanding of it. And I think this is this is something we need to find a better balance on this. So that the problem with the climate debate is that there's kind of twofold. There is, climate change is a problem, but I think, but that said, even the idea of a problem depends on a lot of knowledge about society. But I do think the way we've positioned climate as a problem in society itself tells us a lot about the way we try and solve problems in society, which I don't think is a way of looking at our problems that's very effective. I think basically the way we look at the problems is not a solution to our problems. I think it's constitutive of the problems we face, essentially.
But how do we shift this frame of reference, Dr. Calum? Because if, for example, right now we are stuck with too much with the science of climate change, but then again, if we were to bring in the social science part of it, how and where do we shift the frame of reference of this discussion? And when I'm saying that, I'm also conscious that the extreme weather events, as we are recording today, may it be hurricanes, may it be extreme heat days, they are on the rise. So how do we, is there an urgency looking at the extreme weather events? And having said that, how would you want to shift this debate? What would be the next lever with which maybe we could actually shift this debate in the right direction?
That's a good question. I think we have deep fault lines running through our culture right now. And my general sense, I think you just mentioned the word diagnose problems before, I think, and I like that. I'll pivot off that. Here's my general feeling, is that one of the reasons we have such deference to the physical sciences, the natural sciences, is because of their success. And you can see it's manifested not just in engineering and so on, but also in biomedicine. Some of the biomedical advances of the last few hundred years are quite extraordinary. It could be vaccines and penicillin, whatever it may be, surgery, all these things. But here's my point. I think it's true that our understanding of the body, our understanding of the physical world, but our bodies, is now modern, not medieval. We went through the biomedical revolution. And part of that was learning how to distinguish between symptoms and pathologies. So 600 years ago, 800 years ago, people would look at the Black Death and they would get confused between the symptom and the pathology. They'd see the pustules and they think the pustules, the bubble on their arms, were part of the pathology, but they're the symptom of the pathology. Once we understood the difference between symptom and pathology, and indeed etiology, how it evolved, at that point, we're in a position to solve our physical problems. But here's my point. I believe even if how we understand biological contagion is now, and problems of the body were now modern, I believe in how we understand ideological contagion and problems of the body politic, diseases of the body politic, we are still medieval. We are constantly confusing symptoms and pathologies. I'll give you a quick example of this in a political context. If you look at American politics the last few years, you've had this sort of polarized thing, right? On the one hand, you have the so-called woke activists, progressive activists. On the other hand, you have the sort of Trumpy, I wouldn't really call them conservative often, but they're sort of, because a lot of people who voted for Trump, by the way, voted for Obama 7 or 8 years ago, but basically people left behind by the establishment, and they've turned to this outsider character to represent them. Now, the interesting thing about this distinction is, of these two groups, is that they both look at the other side and say, you're the disease and I'm the cure, and vice versa. And I think they're both wrong, because my sense is that both sides are opposite but equal symptoms of a shared disease that is in need of a cure. So I don't think either side is a disease or the cure. I think both sides are symptoms. But they hate each other. They're looking at each other saying, you're the disease and I'm the cure. But if you fight fire with fire, you end up with inferno. It's a hiding to nowhere. It's a race to the bottom. And so this culture war thing going on in the Anglosphere is hugely unconstructive. And no one is stepping outside of it and diagnosing it properly and saying, oh, hang on, what is the shared problem to which both sides are reaction? I mean, in my sense, what's happening is that you've had in the last 40 years in America, you've had this sort of neoliberal movement where all the jobs went overseas and so on. And look at the effect it's had on people, because if you look at your typical sort of middle America, and I'm stereotyping here, but sort of middle America, blue collar communities, what's happened to them? Their jobs have gone overseas. They feel the establishment, Republican and Democrat, were no longer representing their interests. They were representing corporate interests. And they felt so let down by the establishment, so voiceless, they turned to the one guy who wasn't even part of the establishment himself in terms of Washington. And so those communities are suffering, I think, the consequences of neoliberal, the stripping of their meaning and dignity and community by their car factories going overseas over the last 40 years. So they have a legitimate grievance at the hands of neoliberal capitalism, which they're trying to solve. Or rather, their frustration is a symptom of that. But then look at the young woke activists in, again, to stereotype the coastal cities, who tend to be, rather than blue collar, they're white collar or they're university educated, and they're not middle America, they're coastal America. What are their problems? Well, think about if you're a 25-year-old now living in New York City. You probably have massive student debt, hundreds of thousands of dollars. You've got house prices are unaffordable, rent's pretty much too high. You can barely find a stable job with a long-term career prospect. And also, if you can find a job, it's probably not very well paid. And so they know they will not be able to have the life that their parents had in the suburbs raising them 30 years ago. It's going to be difficult to get married and to have a house and a family and so on. And they know all this, even if they're not admitting it. So what is the one thing they can have? Like Franciscan monks, they can say they have their virtue. They're barefoot preachers. They're going around saying, I may not have anything, but I'm a good person. I'm a virtuous person. And I think we need to understand and have some empathy for that, because if you've got nothing else, you will try and seek meaning in something that isn't material. And so when I look at the two sides, what I see is both sides are suffering the consequences of a sort of neoliberal economy that doesn't put people in the community first. And they're both reacting to it in opposite ways. But of course, through the social media companies, which, by the way, if you're using social media, you're not paying for it. Well, who's paying for the social media? It's the corporations advertising by getting access to our data. So the social media companies know that it's quicker and therefore cheaper to lose trust than build trust. So the way you can drive attention isn't by making someone love something, but rather to make them hate something, so you can see the tweets that are going to aggravate you, and that drives attention. Because it's easier, negative emotions rise in us faster than positive ones, as we all know. It's easier to lose trust in someone than to gain trust. And so they know this, these social media companies, and their customers are the corporations. And the corporations, not only are they getting more attention on stuff by driving people into divisions, but in driving into divisions, it's distracting them from the shared problem, which are these corporations probably damaging their lives. So that, my way of explaining that, you said, well, what is the broader problem we need to solve? Well, for me, I think the broader problem we need to solve is how we diagnose our social problems. And the problem is how we diagnose our social problems have remained medieval. There is nothing different in how you and I diagnose societal pathologies than someone in the 12th or 13th century. We have not gone through we are not modern on that. We have not gone through some sort of evolution on that as we have in the understanding of the physical world. And I think we have a deep cultural problem with this across, certainly in the Western cultures, and which therefore is the global culture through the post-colonial context and the globalization of institutes based on the nation state, based on Central European, early modern, post-Westphalia model. But that whole culture has built into it blind spots that I don't think we're doing enough to recognize, let alone to solve.
My last question to you, Dr. Calum, would be, if there was to be one call to action, you were in a room, and in the room you will find fossil fuel lobby, you will find people like Al Gore, you would find Pacific Islanders who might lose their land because of the rising sea levels, and you would find general population. In that room full of people, if you were to give a call to action with respect to what should be our next steps be with respect to the crisis that we are facing, we can call this Dr. Calum's COP maybe. What would your one call to action be?
Well, I mean, to some extent, is that stop holding these meetings of people who clearly have very different interests, because if they have any conclusion, it's only going to be concluded in a way that is phrased so vaguely that it binds someone to nothing. I remember at COP, I think 26 in Glasgow, there was some sort of agreement they were thinking of reaching, and at the last moment, the Indian government requested a change in the language from saying to phase out to phase down use of fossil fuels. Now, that was an interesting exercise in ambiguity, because phase out is quite definitive, and it's a phrase that exists in English. It's like you phase something out means you get rid of it in time. Phase down is using the phrase phase, which makes you think of phase out, but it doesn't actually have a goal, just phase down. And so it really commits you to nothing. And I went to COP last year, and I've written a piece about it, which I recommend. I thought it was a good piece called Cop Out in Dubai. And it was a bit of a sort of withering sort of satire on the whole thing. But I've never been to anything more depressing. I mean, I have to say, like, Dubai and COP deserve each other. Only late stage capitalism could have produced COP or Dubai, and they absolutely fit together. And and I just looked at it and I thought this entire jamboree of all these people coming together with their stalls, trying to no one there believed in anything. It was just everyone showed up. They had their slogans and their shibboleths, and they'd say all the right words. But if you actually tried to have a conversation with people at COP, it was sometimes like in those computer games when you're talking to an NPC, the non-player characters, that they had their script, and as soon as the script ran out, they had nothing to say to you. And it was a very cynical event. I really don't see the point in it. And so if you had this meeting you're suggesting of all these different actors together, which is in a sense is what COP is actually, I'd say, well, why are you holding this meeting? I think it's only performative. There are actors simply corporations have very different interests from islanders. Politicians have different interests again. I'm not sure there's much to be gained in performatively getting together and saying words that the sentiment sounds great, but doesn't really commit you to anything. I think we're all a bit tired of performative international institutionalism with this stuff. It doesn't seem very real, and people who take it seriously, I think there's something will be achieved. I think are quite naive. I mean, the world is much more agenda driven than that, and the agenda tends to be more realism rather than idealism. But I think in the sort of suburban quarters of the West, we've started to drink our own Kool-Aid. We've started to believe our own myth that we are the ones we were waiting for. We have all the ideals. The end of history has reached us, and I just don't think it's true. I think it's a very naive culture, and so I'd say to them, stop wasting our time.
Would you recommend a similar conference for social scientists where they more rigorously debate as to how to take forward this, maybe, as you've put it, the medieval way how we diagnose problems?
Yeah, and actually, so I'm planning to organize a conference at the University of Cambridge next year with Johan Gardebo, who's an interesting scholar there, and we're trying to organize a conference on precisely to bring together some social scientists and philosophers to talk about climate change and what the climate debate reveals about the nature of our culture and broader fault lines in our culture about how we address and understand and let alone solve problems. Because I think that in my view, the social sciences in academia have become somewhat redundant or corrupted. And a lot of people have a critique of them, say it's all gone woke or something. And my critique is not really that. I think that's just a symptom, if it's even true. But I do think there's a sense of I don't really know often. I mean, I've been to a lot of social science conferences over the years, and quite honestly, it's just the empty pablum that is spoken at them, the endless words with no argument, where it's sloppy sentiment, and I don't see. I've been to a lot of conferences on climate migration, about 30 or 40 of these conferences. And after 2 or 3 of them, you see the pattern. It's always the same pattern, the same people saying the same things. And clearly there's funding available for this stuff, but it's just, I don't think there's no value in it. And it's just a very empty mixture of sentiment, sloppy sentiment, and an analysis. And the analysis is, I don't think it's particularly rigorous, because no one is willing to ask, why are we framing the problem this way? And I really think we need to start interrogating our assumptions and our questions much more than we have been.
Thank you so much, Dr. Calum, for your time. This was really enlightening, and I think through this podcast and what we've been trying to do earlier as well, add another dimension to how we should approach this problem, because clearly shouting aloud about some of the facts have not been able to garner enough action that we might want to have on the ground. So thank you so much for bringing your unique perspectives and enlightening us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.